This video is sponsored by Ask Fred and Dragon Slayers Credentialing and Consulting. Hey guys, it's Cyrus of Chaos. Today I'm here with my old teammate Elijah Granet. We used to fence with each other back when we were both competitive fencers at New York Athletic Club, and because of some of the legal implications of what's going on with the whole trans protest controversy that's happening, I wanted to ask him to apply his legal expertise to this area. So Elijah, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself, and then we can jump into this oh so fun topic.
Hi, yeah, my name is Elijah. My first connection is I've been fencing for many years, including with, as Andrew said, at the New York Athletic Club and for Columbia University, LA Champs.
Reliance.
And I've also studied law both in the UK and then here in the US at USC, where I graduated and have passed the bar. So I can both fence and talk about law, which is my qualification to be here in addition to being friends with Andrew.
So the way that this all kicked off was, I think about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago at this point, something like that. At the Cherry Blossom Open, a cisgender fencer decided to protest the inclusion of a trans fencer by getting down on one knee, filming the protest and posting it on Twitter. And since then, a whole bunch of the media have picked it up. Fox News has written something like 15 articles about it. Ted Cruz sent a letter to the president of USA Fencing threatening our NGB status. So we're just going to talk about some of that. I think probably starting with that letter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, start chronologically. So why don't you share your screen and
Yeah.
we'll start talking about that.
So let's get started. We have here a letter to Phil Andrews, who's the CEO of USA Fencing, and it's from the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which is they just had to shove sports somewhere, and so they put it in Commerce, Science, and Transportation, even though I think pretty arguably fencing is neither commerce nor science nor transportation. Now, if we look at this, it begins by citing a executive order from President Trump called Keeping Men Out of Women's Sports. That is a point that doesn't really matter here, except that it says the policy of the administration. Most of that order is about Title IX funded institutions, which are institutions of higher education.
Which
And
mostly
so
applies to the NCAA programs, right?
Exactly. And so it doesn't generally apply. There is stuff in that executive order about asking all of the various international governing bodies, like the International Olympic Committee, the FIE, saying nicely, can you change your policies? But the only power is to ask nicely because, of course, the Secretary of State does not actually pick the delegates to the FIE.
Huh,
USA Fencing does, and they vote the same as very tiny countries. So Monaco and USA Fencing have the same votes here.
right.
Now, it rehashes things about the letters, but I think where it gets very interesting is that they essentially are saying that the USA Fencing transgender and non-binary policy is in conflict with federal law on this point. And to get to this, it has to go to the question of what is the federal law as it applies to something like USA Fencing. And it's a very strange thing because I think many people know, for example, the USA is one of the few countries where the government does not fund the US Olympic Committee. The government certainly does not fund fencers and their travel, unlike most other countries, as anyone who's tried to compete internationally knows all too well.
Yeah, exactly.
But although that does mean that there is a degree of independence, the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC, as
Mhm.
renamed in 2020, is created by act of Congress. It's a congressionally chartered corporation. And the same laws also say it's the job of the U.S. Olympic Committee to recognize the national governing bodies. And that's something the IOC says. The IOC says every national Olympic committee has to say, these is the committee that governs fencing, archery, whatever. And so there actually is federal law here. And I think once you get past these 3 pages of uh, saying things and asking for evidence and asking for data that I'm pretty sure USA Fencing does not have on transgender fencers, it gets to something interesting, and that is the legal obligations on a national governing body. So we go here to the United States Code, deep within Title 36 to 220,522 sections in.
Oh my God.
Um, we get to the details of national governing bodies. And so it gets to a few things that the Senate is highlighting that may or may not be issues. And one of them is discrimination and fair opportunity and participation on the basis of sex. Now, as it stands in another statutory context, the US Supreme Court has held that discrimination against a transgender person is discrimination on the basis of sex. The reasoning being essentially that if you let a woman show up to work in a dress, a biological cisgender woman showing up to work in a dress, but you say you can't show up to a dress because your birth certificate says you're a man, that's sex discrimination.
Hmm.
And that was the reasoning of Justice Gorsuch in that case. Now, it's hard to say how far that goes. That was a statutory interpretation case. That's not a constitutional case. It could be different in this little corner of the US code. But I think one of the questions is as the government shifts its policy, will there be a shift in how the courts do it? And the executive order the Trump administration put out cites a few district court opinions, I think one in like Kansas those don't really hold that much weight, but it's possible. I think the other thing that they raise is that the national governing body is supposed to clearly have good criteria for its policies, for how it does things, for how it communicates to athletes, for how it sets its guidelines, for how it does representation. And I think all of those things in its procedures raise potential questions. I think, though, ultimately, when they look at this, the truth is that almost everything USA Fencing does is fairly transparently put out. It's just very few people bother to read it or pay attention
Yep.
to minutes because we want to play a sport. We don't really want to read a bunch of board of directors minutes. That's why, frankly, people who serve on the board are always braver than I would be because I love fencing. I don't know if I love fencing that much through board meetings. But that is essentially the point. So it's is it free from outside restraint? Is it governing things safely? Is it ensuring that athletes are not being discriminated against? And I think the biggest question is going to be ones relating to safety and the thing about safety. Now, people might be wondering at this point, well, hang on, isn't the USA Fencing implementing the FIE rules? And I think this is where it gets a little complicated. So the FIE, the International Governing Body of Fencing, implements the International Olympic Committee's guidelines. It does not have to. They are, to quote Pirates of the Caribbean, there really are guidelines. They're not rules. And so but it essentially does that. And if you look at the FIE documents, and I did, there's essentially no real policy. It's been raised. It was raised at the 2023 FIE Congress. It was, I think, really decided at the 2015 FIE Congress. It's not an issue the FIE has really given much thought to. I think mainly because it just hasn't come up.
We're
And
a
so they've
small sport.
adopted those.
Yeah, we're a small sport, and transgender athletes take up such a small percentage of that that it's just not something that I think has become relevant to them yet.
Right. And I've known and know trans fencers. I'm not aware of anyone at a high level of competition that would even get to something where the FIE would care.
Right.
And most of the FIE Congress is figuring out how to, as we all know, transparently, openly, and cleanly allocate money with no other issues. And I'm sure they're very busy doing their job of being a great regulator that's above board and for everything. But I think that is the issue is that there is separate programs, participation for women, how all that is interpreted. And then I think the biggest one relates to safe sport and the safety of people. So the Senate letter essentially says things to the point of a transgender woman fencer may have more strength, may be able to thwack people. I think they don't really understand how fencing works, that if at least in our weapon and saber, if you're going to thwack someone, you're just asking to get counterattacked.
True.
But it's a point that is one that can be raised, and I think one that there is federal law here and it's not clear, and it's something where it could go either way. I think where it gets a little ridiculous is the point about Congress revoking standing. Now, Congress could do that. Congress could pass a law to do so. They cite something in the US code about monitoring it and ensuring that the Congress can be replaced. But what they don't say is that it can be replaced only by arbitration or the proceedings or a new act of Congress. There is not going to be an act of Congress about USA fencing. Congress is passing very little legislation, is not going to pass a law on this. So I think that is overstated. I do think, though, that pressure from the federal government could at least move these things and could deal with the fact that, at least for domestic competition and domestically sanctioned competition, there is exclusive jurisdiction to USA fencing. And ultimately, I don't think that they can say that they have to follow the rules. There's an obligation in the law that they have to communicate rule changes internationally to the domestic athletes. They have to say, oh, the FIE has changed this. You need to know your masks are different now. I don't really think there's an obligation that they have to use the same rules. And of course, USA fencing doesn't always use the same rules, both for things like equipment, sometimes for various rules. They let us referee in English, which is very nice of them. So there are things that are less clear. And I think that these Senate hearings are not going to do what the big swinging letter says and revoke USA fencing's existence. They are, however, going to put pressure, and USA fencing is going to have to be able to come to the committee and say, this is how we interpret it. And I think now all the eyes look to the courts, and how are the courts going to read safety? How are the courts going to read sex discrimination? And how are the courts going to be reading the relation between the national governing body and the international federation?
Right. And then in addition to all of this, we also received a letter from, what was it, the DOGE subcommittee.
Yes, a recently invented subcommittee featuring a well-known Congress character, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has been issuing witness invitations to Stephanie Turner, who is the cisgender woman who took a protest at that ROC in Maryland, and also to Damien Lefelt, the chair of USA Fencing, the fencing coach, I think a pretty well-known figure, and citing his blog posts. So at least someone's reading them. It's always nice to know your work has a reach, even if Marjorie Taylor Greene maybe wasn't the
The intended target.
audience. I'm not really sure what this has to do. To go back to the thing I started with, there is not really money going to USA fencing in terms of grants because we don't get government money in the United States. There may be something of like a tax code thing where they got a grant to study something. These things happen where you get a small government project. It is fundamentally not a government funded body, as
Right.
I think, again, anyone who's committed knows. If they want to make it government funded, that's one thing, but it is. And they also cite the executive war, and they cite the U.S. Education Secretary's potential Title IX investigation. I think, again, outside of education and outside of federally funded stuff, it's less clear. I think what this is really about is a thing that happens in Congress, just performative. They want to get Stephanie Turner to come in and tell her story, and then they want to yell at Damien for a while. He does not have to go. I think he lives in DC. It may be convenient to. It's not a legal requirement. I think, though, that the subtext of this statement, the only interesting thing is it says putting female athletes in physical danger, and that gets to the safe sport requirements, the things, and and just to remind everyone, safe sport is a creation of Congress. They wanted to clean up sport. So all of that is in the United States Code. It's all federal law. It's all congressionally chartered. All the duties are there. And I think that is where the argument is going to go rather than the sex equality. I think some of this is they see swords and they think that anyone fencing is in physical danger of more than ankle injuries.
Right.
Um, so it will be theater. This is unlike the Senate thing, really not citing anything that I think is relevant here.
So regarding safety, even though we do quote unquote play with swords, I don't remember which Olympics they did this at, but it, I think fencing was the second lowest rate of injury amongst all Olympic sports at that time, including other sports like shooting. So we're a pretty safe sport, and whenever there's an injury that's related to some form of equipment failure, like I remember when I was competitive on the international circuit, my teammate Jeff Spear had a blade break and go through his hand, all the way through his hand, and it was a pretty serious injury. He's since recovered from that almost completely, but at the time that it happened, there was a World Cup in 2 weeks, and the FIE basically said that the glove was not providing sufficient protection to prevent injuries like that, had the gloves all redesigned and made mandatory within that 2 week period. So whenever an injury like that happens, the FIE is really, really on top of things. It is one of the things that they do the best is care about the safety of their athletes. And as a result, there are very few injuries in our sport that are related to equipment failures. Things like when we are going backwards and sprain our ankles, or I think Elijah had torn something in his hip from doing a lunge. But those are injuries that could happen like that are sex independent. It doesn't matter whether he's fencing a cisgendered or transgendered opponent, like that is just something independent. So as far as safety goes, our sport is pretty safe.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's why it's a weaker argument, but it's clearly the one they want to emphasize because politically, obviously, safety is a very tender issue. And I think,
Hmm.
especially in sports, and no one understands fencing and understands how incredibly safe it is.
Yes.
And especially compared to something like football or any other sport that's really a combat sport. However, I think the real legal juice will be in the question of interpreting women's equality and if the direction of interpretation, even though it's not directly applicable, in the keeping men out of women's sports executive order is upheld by the courts, and I think it's not impossible it will be, then it becomes a question of does the statutory requirement for separate male and female competitions and ensuring equality and things like that, how will that be interpreted? I think, though, that the answer is no one knows. And I think USA fencing, whether you agree with their policy or not, cannot be faulted for not following the law because it's impossible to ask them to follow a law that hasn't been clarified and has potentially two contradictory meanings.
Right, and especially in our case, we're just inheriting these policies from the FIE, the USOPC, and higher up, those policies come from the IOC.
Exactly. And so the IOC guidelines may change, the FIE rules may change, and even if the FIE rules change to be more trans restrictive, the USA fencing does not necessarily have to follow for domestic competitions, but probably
For
will because they
international
want to for
selections.
selection and
Yep.
things. And so that is where it all becomes interesting. I think, though, that a lot of these letters are just for congressional theater. I think the interesting thing will be does anything in the federal government start going to sue USA Fencing or launch investigations or seek to revise the safe sport rules? But I think as things stand, this is mostly a lot of noise. It's just the fact that there are these provisions about equality and safety that could be interpreted either way. That's the only kind of question mark here.
Do you think that the letter that Ted Cruz sent is more legally threatening, but still not super legally threatening, and the one that Marjorie Taylor Greene sent has almost no teeth at all? Is that correct?
I think that's exactly right. So the one Ted Cruz sent is citing the law, it's pointing out that there are duties, and what it is doing that is going to be interesting is it's asking questions of USA fencing. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, just wants to yell at Damien,
Hmm.
and which in Congress you can do. It just doesn't lead to much. The
Other
actual
than the
fact that
spectacle
these
of it, like
were,
you said before.
yeah, the Senate wants written answers to questions and statistics, and it is a legitimate oversight function of this committee to deal with looking at how the congressionally chartered corporations are doing their job of overseeing Olympic sport in the United States. And so USA Fencing's answers will be very interesting, and I'm sure the Senate letter will actually have USA Fencing's lawyers working hard. I
A
don't
lot of
think
data that they
right.
requested.
And I some of that data in there I don't think they have, but I think the question of how does USA Fencing's trans policy comply with these statutory obligations? Question that you can very clearly answer while defending the current policy, but it's one of those things where the way they answer that will then be scrutinized, I think, by other organs of the government. And then, yeah, the data stuff, I would be astonished if USA Fencing has any data on trans fencers. And if I have yet to see a referee turn into the bout committee anything noting the trans or cisgender status of the fencers in that bout.
Right, yeah. I think there was one point where it wasn't about trans specifically. They just were requesting in the last 4 years how many bouts have occurred at USFA sanctioned events between men or transgender women and women. And so for mixed events, like they don't keep detailed records of stuff like that at all because those things are only held at local events. I don't think that there are any regional events, and there certainly aren't any national events that are mixed.
Right. And I think USA Fencing's answer will be these are all our divisions. They cannot make USA Fencing spend money and do a study to do this. They don't have that power. So they may have data because I'm sure the divisions report how many tournaments they sanctioned, how many were mixed. They can probably say that. It will, I think, though, the committee really wants to know is how many times have trans people competed in women's competitions, and that is data that I am completely sure is not present.
Yeah, I agree. Anything else you want to say about this issue?
No, I think though that it's an issue that is probably not going to be great for fencing to have a lot of congressional oversight. I also think though that a lot of it will just very rapidly become bigger than fencing. I think fencing got caught up in this, but I think ultimately there's a big policy debate that's happening. There's polling, there's lots of opinions out there. People can go and see them. I think ultimately this is going to be a bigger national conversation, and I think when the next thing rolls around, when the next one of these things that makes a lot of media attention happens, it probably won't be fencing. And I think then the sport will move on. And I think ultimately this is really a thing about the USOPC, about the NCAA. I think it's fundamentally not a thing where fencing is unique or stands out. And I think in that sense, it's unfair to target fencing, particularly when clearly both these people in Congress and I think also a huge percentage of the population, I think a fair majority of issues with the the entire structure of how sport deals with this pretty small percentage of athletes.
Right. I think if you're looking for data that shows that transgendered athletes have an advantage over cisgendered athletes, fencing is the worst place to look because so much of our sport is about precision, timing, balance, and those are non-gendered things.
Right. It may be that the speed and timing have some advantage. It may be that there is a sex difference. I really don't know. I went to law school, not biology school, and I don't claim to know. I will say that for fencing, there's so little studies of it
Right,
because
exactly.
it's
There's
such a
not
small
enough data.
sport. It is one of the last things that I think will ever be studied, and you even see this in the Senate letter where they're citing general points.
Mhm.
I don't. really know the details of this. I'm sure if someone out there wants to do a PhD dissertation, they probably won't get funding because no one will care about one dissertation on fencing. I do think though that whatever this is, it's a bigger conversation on sports, and I think ultimately the country, for better or worse, does not care that much about fencing.
Agreed. All right. Thank you for your time, Elijah. That was really helpful.
Always a pleasure.
Hey guys, it's Cyrus of Chaos. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to help sponsor these videos, you can do that at the Patreon link in the description. I will see you in the next one. Thanks.